open source models to inform action. And we have a distinguished and fascinating panel of people to speak to you today on this. I want to start with a few housekeeping rules. Please note that this session is being recorded and we will make it available to the public. On your screen, you will see currently a poll about energy modelling. There are just 4 questions, so it's very quick. If you could complete that would be wonderful. We'll tell you the results a little later on to help frame the discussion. If you have questions for the panelists at any point, you can submit those through the Q&A.
Por eso, pero lo quieren poner ¿en dónde? ¿En el Congress?
Somebody needs to mute themselves. So you can put those through the question and answer function at the bottom. There is also a chat if you want to just make some comments and have some conversations along the side on this. But with that, I would like to move forward in the session. We're going to start with a presentation on the overall Open Decarbonization Initiative by Oleg Lugovoy. Oleg is in the Office of the Chief Economist, which is the office that I lead as Chief Economist. He is an economic modelling expert and economic policy research analyst. Oleg received his PhD in economics from the Institute for the Economy and Transition in Moscow and his master's from the State University's Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And he's been involved in the modelling field for very many years now. So passing over to you, Oleg. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen. So just a second. Okay. 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 Good. So, goal of my intro is just describes the initiative which is in development, and we welcome your feedback and your ideas, how to push it forward, and if it's valuable for everyone. So let me just introduce what we have in mind, what we have been discussing during last year. So, open decarbonization. So, some prehistory. Well, open source actually energy modeling is booming, and during last decade and maybe during last few years is especially booming. And if we go to Openmod initiative website, we can find at least like more than 50 models open. Data is becoming more accessible, so you can have data for free and online, as well as you can have models, but still only few countries are covered with open source models, and so new challenges appears on the horizon. So for modeling, models have to adopt quickly. So this is why we started thinking about it. So what is our assumption were like high demand still exists for modeling tools around the world. So you maybe have different opinion. We will see now poll soon. And another assumption is if we have broader modeling community, it will be helpful to reduce uncertainty in available abatement options around the world. So this is 2 assumptions. But new challenges is so new tools are required to fit the so-called renewables era, when we have to deal with variability of renewables and we need to develop new practices. So, and barriers are still high to research. Mostly it's available for consulting and some think tanks, but it's not available or very hard to get it for PhD students. It's changing, it's getting more accessible, but it's still not everywhere and still very hard. So these assumptions, and can actually models developed by other people and for other countries be reused or not. So, well, on one of Openmod workshops, conferences, there was a poll asking if you use your own model, develop your own models, or you adopt someone's models. And most modelers actually attending, they were saying, so we developing our own model. So why? Maybe features are not really available, which you want to do for your study. And it's maybe unclear what kind of features, maybe not enough documentation, not enough support. And so some models are precisely focused on one country, on one sector, which makes it difficult to understand how to recalibrate the model to another project. Well, entrance barriers are quite high, but should be lower. So starting time, so the goal is to make the model more accessible, so to reduce these barriers, and from decades to develop the model and become the professional to like months, like PhD student can or master can focus on particular problem of research, not developing the whole model. And the cost should be reduced also from millions of dollars to enter the market and support the team and the software and so on to just negligible. So how can we reduce entrance barriers and scale up front-running modeling practices and inform global action? Well, here are some ideas for discussion for today. So for developers, probably we should focus on reapplication from the beginning. So we have, when we develop models, it's they're not just to particular project, but should be, so we should think, or modelers, developers should think how the model can be potentially reapplied for other problems, for other country. And fundraising also might be shifted from one particular project to like scaling up the project and encouraging contribution from other participants. Well, it can be also potentially done with collaborative studies where more countries involved in particular topic for comparative exercises and so on. And target participants can be here universities and think tanks who can have free models, free support in exchange for contribution to the project. This is some of ideas, and so we actually tried to format somehow, and it's still developing. So we have open models, we have open data. What we need the open studies, scenarios, we need to scale up somehow. So if we have, if we can quickly recalibrate models from one project to another, it will be beneficial for everyone, I guess. Okay, and I'm going to just show the reevaluation, renewables evaluation pilot project. So we trying to test the idea. It's not, it's under development, and we don't have actual project. So it's just, we're trying to test what can be potentially done. And so why, for example, reevaluation, why renewables? Well, because it's new era. And if we look at the numbers, like Energy Information Administration this year published that wind, solar energy is already cheaper. Should we, and if we go to projections, will be potentially even 2-3 times lower in the future, which is very, very probable. So should we already declare that renewables energy like won the competition and renewables revolution on its way, and maybe renewables scenarios, high renewable scenarios for many countries, not maybe for all locations, are already business as usual because they're cost efficient, but we don't have yet in the modeling. So this is why we need tools which are kind of on many teams trying to develop. And all tools I'm not going to say, so have assumptions how much renewables can be integrated. You need to go high resolution. So we have, EDF has its own modeling practices with China Energy Modeling Forum in different studies, and we're also contributing to open source modeling. So this is why we just took our tools which we're familiar with and models we developed last year for feasibility study of electric power sector transition to zero emission. This is SEPRA model and Usensis models in development, and we are contributing to the open source, as I already mentioned. So evaluation, this idea is, well, we have open data with from MERA project. It's 40 years of one hour resolution, 50 by 60 kilometers, and we can use it, so why not? So it's, and we have GIS information, already free available. So the idea is to develop kickstarting models for greenfield, copper plate. It's a beginning, but it's expandable, so you can add something in the later and try to make this kickstarting model available for any locations with a very low cost. So here is just some examples from MERA. So we evaluate renewables based on 40 years data, and as a result, we have optimized energy system. Again, it's one region, but many locations of renewables, and we have different options of flexibility on demand side. So this is just example what can be done, and so we can scale up, and we already run it for 8 countries and 2 more joining. So, and right now it's like 1 day to build a model for 1 country. What is built is, so we don't go into details for these locations, but just take the open source data and put it in the same model. So we have reports ready for another model, but it's not results of study. Study should be done by someone else who will be using probably this model or in collaboration with us or by themselves. So some information already published on the GitHub, and the model itself will be published pretty soon, in a few days. So next steps, we need more models, kickstarting kits, and we're discussing with Switch team, which already can be also providing such tools. And we need more countries involved, we need more scenarios and more analysis. So this is the idea, and this is the goal, and we are now discussing how to do it. So that's it. I just want to finish with a citation from Trevor Noah that we don't want just teach someone to fish, we also have to provide the role. That's it. Thank you very much. I think I'm down on time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Oleg. That was extraordinary use of time. You've left lots of great time for us to discuss. If you can stop sharing your screen, that'd be great. So thank you for that. So we're now moving into a panel where we will have a number of people looking at the role of open source energy models in policy, in climate policy. So we have people who have a lot of experience both on the modeling side, but critically on actual application of those models into policy spaces. So they know how they're actually used in some of the countries that are our target. So as we all know, we need all countries to decarbonize, to stabilize the climate. And that includes small developing countries who are often very short on the sorts of tools that Oleg has talked about. There's a key barrier that they face, and this is brought up over and over again, is that they don't know how to decarbonize. Even when they're willing to, they want to start in that process, they can't see the pathway towards decarbonization. That makes it extremely difficult to formulate policy, to work with others, to work effectively with potential investors, etc. Even if they are confident, those people are trying to help, if you don't know where you're going, it's very hard to take the first steps. There's also, of course, the risk that there are some actors who are resisting the change, that are owners of some of those stranded assets that Oleg has talked about, and they are trying to bring information into the conversation that makes it seem as though this is not a good pathway, and that creates a lot of uncertainty for those who are making decisions that particularly in environments where they're very resource scarce and there are a lot of competing priorities. So I guess the challenge that we're trying to address in this wider initiative is trying to work out how open source modeling can be used to help address some of those challenges. So you've all kindly completed the poll that was put up. Chocola, I don't know if you can share those results on the screen. So on the first question, what we saw, this was, what is the role of energy policy models in climate policy now? And 90% of you think that it's already very important. In terms of energy modeling systems, a much smaller percentage, only 45% think that they are reliable, complex, top-notch tools. A lot of you are unsure. You just don't know what you think about those tools. And hopefully this session today will at least provide some more information into that space. 85% of you, an overwhelming think that model-based analyses should play a larger role in our decision-making processes. So our challenge is to work out how to make that happen. And finally, 77% think that if we could create a broad societal awareness that emissions abatement is technically feasible, and of course make sure that it really is technically feasible and economically affordable, then we would be able to get faster decarbonisation. Some of you are not so sure about that, and obviously there are other barriers too, but clearly many of you think that's a really important part of the solution. So I'd now like to move on to our panellists. Our first panellist is a very distinguished guest, Tako Net, who is the Assistant Professor of Professional Practice in the School of Sustainable Energy Engineering at Simon Fraser University. He has a PhD in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Victoria in Canada. Thank you, Tako. You have 5 minutes. Each speaker has about 5 minutes, so we have plenty of time for conversation.
Great, I'll try and keep it fast. And so, yeah, so just looking at the role of open source energy models in climate policy, I think the place to start for that discussion is really the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And what we're trying to do with all of this work is really effectively address all these different aspects of the challenge that we're facing. So climate is number 13 here, a very important one. Decarbonization to address the climate issue that we have is really important. It's clearly inherently linked to the energy system and affordable and clean energy, but there's links across all these different pieces. And I think one of the pieces of this sort of puzzle that I think is really important is this peace, justice, strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. And to be able to enable those institutions and enable the partnerships for the goals, there has to be open and transparent analysis from the starting point of the model and the structure of the model and how it's used, all the way through to the data and everything in between. All those pieces I think are really important to be able to meet the goals, to be able to meet the intersection of all these goals. That open analysis becomes really important. And so that's sort of my starting point of viewing why we want these open source models is without open source and without open data, it's really hard to meet these broad goals that we're looking for. Move my slide there. So I was asked here partially because I am a member. I'm not sure if there's no official membership for Openmod. So Openmod is a group of informal volunteers, modelers, and people who believe in open models and data. And it's one of the groups that's been putting a lot of effort into sort of promoting open tools and open data. The openmodinitiative.org, I think Olaf, you had, or Oleg, sorry, you had that in your talk as well. And it's a group of volunteers and modelers who believe in open models and open data, engage on discussions of like legal issues of open models and open data. They have, there's a forum where people ask questions about, well, where do I get data for this? Where do I get data for that? Across all continents, there's a wiki, there's workshops, and there's about 700 people on the mailing list, 500 on the forum. That changes over time as well, so there's shifting there. But this is one organization which I think being part of and supporting will help move some of that discussion forward. Some examples of open modeling and sort of where it's been used and how it's been used and why that's where it's been effective. So some of my work, there's CLUES, which is the Climate, Land, Energy, and Water Systems Model. This is with the United Nations, and I've gone to a number of different countries to, as an invited expert, to present on the CLUES model and help the country build their own CLUES model. So this is not people going in and saying, here's a model, you should use it, but it's helping them build it and learn how to use it so that they can effectively use that model. Everything in there is open source, the documentation is open. Some of the data is proprietary to the country. We try and do as much open there as we can, but we want to make sure, at least within the country, that they can share their data within the country for their decision making. I was also asked to talk a little bit about Canadian examples. One place to find a lot of information on Canadian energy modeling is this Energy Modeling Initiative. That's not all open source there, but that's sort of the place where you can go and find a lot of information on the different modeling that's happening in different places. There's my group at SFU, Delta E+, and we are working with the CLUES model. We work with osmosis. Some of the work that I do with the UN is connected to that as well. Collaboration between SFU and University of Texas on some modeling. They have a model of the United States electricity system, and we're trying to put Canada into that. And then I know there's work at University of Victoria with osmosis as well. Other places across Canada that are using open modeling, unfortunately, I'm not that clear on the other places which might be using open modeling. There's definitely modeling happening, and we can look at that with the Energy Modeling Initiative. And so one of the pieces that's required for good open modeling and good effective open modeling, to get to sort of this concept that Oleg was talking about getting to really usable models that are easy to implement and easy to switch. There's a group of people, Optimus Community. They're working on these UGRIA standards for data modeling and processing of different policy tools, and getting the community standards, so the Ubuntu community for transparency and accountability, and then principles and specific details of how we actually do that, how we do development, and how we do pushing towards these sustainable development goals in ways that does a lot of this that Oleg is looking for. So trying to provide the fishing rod as well so that it's available in open source. And so there's previous principles, there's the FAIR principles and the European open government principles. And UGRIA sort of puts those together and makes a broader stroke, because FAIR and the open governance principles don't do quite enough on their own. And so that's sort of a summary of open modeling, Canadian context a little bit, and also why I think it's important for those sustainable development goals. And I think that was about 5 minutes. So we'll leave it at that.
Extraordinary, yes.
We will take questions
Excellent.
afterwards, so I'll stop sharing.
So please think of good questions for Taco that we can follow through on later. I'd like to now move to Germán Romero. Germán is an advisor to the Deputy Minister of Finance in Colombia. He's also a long-term colleague with EDF. We worked a lot on trying to design particularly emissions pricing policies in Colombia. Germán has experience as a modeler, but also a lot of experience actually working in the process of trying to get climate policy through. So Germán, please take the floor.
Thank you. I don't know if you can listen to here.
We can hear you and we can see your screen, but it's not in full screen. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for this invitation. It is a pleasure to stay here. Thank you, Susie. Thank you, Olaf. Thank you, everyone. And yes, I want to show a little bit how in Colombia we use this kind of models and what the objectives that we use, and then what is a good practice that we have when we discuss this in terms of open decarbonization. So just this is a policy context that right now we have at least three terms when we discuss the public policy. The first, it is a short term. It is, we have a national plan, national development plan, and these require answers specifically about how to do it. It means we needed more details about the projects. But as mentioned, Teiko, in the previous presentation, the SDG objectives requires more analysis and different options that we have to do. So, and the uncertainties beginning to increase. And when we discuss the long term, as a vision that we have in the pathway to decarbonization, that we need a vision, and the uncertainties increase. And the next question is about how to do that possible. So with this in mind, it is what we use a different kind of models. And one models that we developed, and the other that requires other ideas. For example, in the long term, we have an economic models, but by our update NDC, we use LEAP model as an energy model that helps to include another measures. And when we think about the long-term visions, we use GCAM or GEMS that are just another models, and we develop. So just mentioning the medium-term models, and I want to say that we develop in the government one model, a general equilibrium model that has an energy expression that is MEX4C, that they use for modeling different ideas. But the key for the use of the government, it is that we use compare for different models. Using different models or stay in a platform when we can compare and discuss the results, it is so useful because give us a more options, so that we have a different storytellings that we can use when we discuss the public policy. And it is so interesting how do we mix the economic models with the energy models with the integrate analysis models as well. So this is an example that we developed in the case with ClimaCap and LAMP project that was an international platform that different modeling tried to put together to answer questions about the carbon tax or the impact of the energy sector due to the climate change. And we write a few papers about that. But the second questions, when we see the long-term models, the other step is use the uncertainties as a good way to approach. This means we right now working in a GDP lag project. This means decarbonization, deep carbonization pathways for Latin American with the Inter-American Development Bank. And then we try to think about how to modeling the uncertainties, because it's a huge different uncertainties in policy, in climate, in GDP, in economic as well, and use this one to put up pathways, to put a basin of solutions. And it is another good use of this kind of models. And finally, in the Minister of Finance, we are develop a economic model as well, but it is useful, an integrated model that is called GEMS, that allows to use these uncertainties to try to include in dynamic and show how the stability in economic discussions. This is the crazy graph that is in the end, but allows to show if we go in this pathway, how is the compliance with the NDC and the other economy? What is the consistency? But this is possible, all these discussions, because we are develop some models. So at the end, I want to show some good practices that Colombia has. And one of them is we develop our own models, but use the support of the university, and it requires time and building capacity. It is not just one time that we can use. We needed to be sure that these kind of models and capacity building in the people continue in the time. It is key for this kind of project. The other, it is not good idea, but it is useful that international discussions go with one model and say, this is the answer. Perhaps it is good and is useful, but it's better when the government has the opportunity to discuss in the same level with his own models and as show you this comparability in the model is key. The other, of course, when we begin in the model by zero is so difficult. So the open sources allow to reduce the barriers in terms of the discussion, the techniques, the flexibility, and because all model requires a calibration for each country, and it is require more time and capacity. And so interesting that I have to say is that the policymaker have a questions that perhaps it is not on all answers in the model, but the model give us the intuitions, give us the relationships that we needed to try to answer these policy questions. So it is the other use. So that's why the building, the capacity building is key. And that's why we needed the research deadlines are not the same in the policymakers. And sometimes try to put in a paper one solution of the model, perhaps required 3 years. That happens presently with a paper that we wrote, but the answer was in a few months. So we needed to work together in terms of develop this model, try to answer easy questions, perhaps in not sophisticated way sometimes, but as well think in the future how to include in this discussion. That's why I'm saying just for the end, these partnerships and discussion between research centers are important to try to answer some questions and as well working together to move in a more deep questions. So this is the general idea about the experience in Colombia to use this kind of models, and that's it. This is my.
Thank you, Herman. That was very helpful. So now we'll move across the world to India. We have the honor of having Balachandra Patil, who has agreed to join us at a very strange hour of the day. Thank you, Balachandra. Balachandra is Chief Research Scientist at the Indian Institute of Science. He has a master's and a bachelor's degree in engineering, and his PhD is in engineering, energy and environment at also at the Indian Institute of Science. Take it away, Balachandra.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I am a new entrant to this open energy modeling, thanks to EDF, especially Oleg, Partha, and Lavanya. See, as academicians, we are fascinated by the process of developing models themselves. Keeping to ourselves, owning models used to be our preferred research. As an individual, I was involved in working on developing models for the past 25 years. But of late, we are also experiencing a different set of questions from policymakers as well as other experts, including to a certain extent politicians themselves. They are not satisfied with the very attractive model outputs, in graphic forms or in table form. They ask about the models themselves. They were no more happy with the black box kind of models. Two things become important. Not only the model outputs, even the models needs to be acceptable, transparent, verifiable, even to the larger policymakers. So I felt the age of black box models and developing alternative scenarios with new set of assumptions, new data is over. In other words, energy models cannot remain static. They need to be dynamic. Not only in terms of data, the structure itself needs to be evolving. Now, I started believing, a dynamic modeling framework which are evolving based on the needs of the country. Like India, as such, wants to look beyond just decarbonization because there are several other constraints. which are, typical to Indian context, because it's a large country, it's a growing country. Still, poverty is a dominant issue. The related issues are issues of unemployment or generating employment, the larger, the socio-technical constraints. Can we develop such models which integrate not only the constraints based on technology and resources, they go beyond this? Can I achieve deep decarbonization or move towards zero carbon, simultaneously maximize employment generation? Those kind of questions would be very relevant and attractive for Indian policymakers. In the past, what I prefer to call as black box models, we try to integrate these kind of things. Can sustainability become the final goal of energy modeling exercise? How optimally we can achieve sustainability? Sustainability, I mean, which integrates the concerns of economic aspirations, the social well-being, and environmental well-being. Can we achieve a trade-off kind of solutions through optimization? Those were some of the questions we're trying to do. But unfortunately, when you come out with a model, the questions change. That's why I emphasized on the models needs to be evolving. And as a single team with a small group of experts, it would become extremely difficult to manage a continuous evolving model. I think there the open access helps to a large extent, where a larger group of people can get involved, contribute to build newer set of understandings, ideas, how we can integrate the policy related aspects in a technical modeling kind of like, for example, in the Indian electricity system, it is evolving not only in terms of expanding infrastructure. The regulations are changing. At present, the Indian electricity system is largely dominated by government control and management. And it is moving from government control to larger private sector participation. The business of electricity itself is changing and evolving. The models needs to take into account those kind of things. And some of the earlier speakers, spoke about the challenges associated with renewable energy integration. How do we integrate the supply side interventions and demand side interventions so that we get into an optimal system that aims towards kind of zero carbon goal? In other words, what I'm trying to do, the system itself is becoming very complex, and a small set of experts cannot manage such kind of systems. And the learning has to evolve, the system has to evolve. And I think with that kind of new set of questions, I too became fascinated with open access modeling. And at present, we are working on a couple of case studies in the Indian context. I don't want to elaborate too much on the outputs at this stage. I think Dr. Oleg may have better idea compared to me about the present set of, the status of the model. And another fascinating thing is, as I said, the Indian electricity system is evolving. It is not only in terms of, getting newer set of technologies getting integrated into the system. The consumption itself, the consumption pattern itself is evolving. If I look back some 15 years back, our electricity used to peak in the morning. In other words, we used to have a distinct morning peak and night peak, or I would prefer to call as evening peak. Now that morning peak has become noon peak, and evening peak has moved into midnight peak. This evolving consumption itself presents newer set of challenge. And the question that becomes important here is the world models, how can they address and resolve these kind of transitions that are occurring in the system at large. And I think given that, I feel open access modeling is presenting a newer challenges. It is not only for the academicians or the modeling community, it should go beyond and evolve into addressing the questions that are raised by the policymakers and politicians at large. I think I will stop here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Balachandra. Really interesting, different perspective. We're getting people at very different stages in this process of using models. So moving now to Michael Roberts with a sort of an academic modeling perspective. Michael is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Hawaii. His PhD is in agricultural resource economics from Berkeley, and he is involved in the Switch modeling project. Thank you, Michael.
Let me unmute and share my screen. I do have a few slides. I've got too many windows open though, so give me a second while I find my slides. Well, shoot, I can see my slides right here, but I can't see them on my sharing.
Can you just share your whole screen?
That's probably a good idea. You guys can see all the crazy stuff I've got. Oh wait, maybe there it is. I've got it. Okay, so I'm going to, I've probably got too much here, but I think they're pretty similar points that other people were making, and I'll try to give some kind of concrete examples. But I come from agriculture. I did a lot of work in agriculture, and I used to be at U.S. Department of Agriculture. And you know, we had a bunch of models there looking at the agricultural sector, and I didn't believe them. And I think that's kind of critical here. Is the starting point is no one believes our models. We have a credibility problem, and at the same time, they're fundamental. They're really critical to this transition. So how do you reconcile those two? And I think that's why you need open source here. So you want open source for the usual reasons. I think people understand that. There's a lot of advocates probably for open source in the room, but I said the usual reasons squared. So the two overarching reasons, and I think other people have sort of said this, are to kind of improve the science of modeling, which is really necessary right now because it's a brand new kind of system, and to improve the policy process. But I think these are particularly important in the electricity sector, much more so than other parts of the economy that we might be interested in decarbonization or any other sort of policy analysis. So I'm going to try to touch on that. So first, the complexity of electricity systems and with renewables in general, all the variability and dealing with intermittency and storage, it's a totally different kind of system. We need a lot of innovation. So open source can help us find errors, help us make the assumptions more transparent to each other, so we can improve the models, you know, as analysts, I suppose. And help us draw connections between the assumptions and results. So we need to understand that before, of course, we can explain it and convince policymakers of it. And of course, it's easier to build upon others' work. Others have mentioned this, and avoid unnecessary redundancy. We have a long ways to go before we get to those last two stages, particularly, and we all become familiar enough with each other's assumptions and models and how we get there. Why is this so difficult? There's so many vested interests here. Susie mentioned that, you know, there's all these stranded assets, but I think it's important to step back. You know, as economists, there's economists and engineers, I imagine, in the room, The economists, we think in terms of market failures. And we all know about, you know, the externalities. We want to price carbon. That's probably not enough. And in fact, I don't think it's the most important thing right now. We also have network monopolies. And that's a big market failure. So the invisible hand isn't going to work. Regulation is critical. And what's going to guide regulation is these models, and it does guide these models everywhere, or it guides policy. Models guide policy everywhere. So models have a critical role in regulation at multiple levels. You know, at the very, very local level, they sit underneath all the rate cases. There's a model that's run, and they set allowed revenue for a utility. So you see that in the ground level, and Matthias has been on the front lines of that. He can talk a bit to that, and I've seen some of it. But you also see it at higher levels too, right? You see it when you think about transmission at FERC at the national level, or you think about international level. We've heard people talk about, you know, large run goals, but I think it matters a lot in the details of the process. Let's not forget about that. It underpins clean air regulations, you know, so EPA has their models, and you need coordination between all these different levels of governance. And unless there's some kind of common understanding of what the trade-offs are, you're not going to get effective policy. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we're pretty far from that. So models can aid coordination between sectors, between states, and between different regions, and between different levels of government, guiding policy at the international level, at the federal level, state, and local individual utilities. And we're so far from that. And I think it's conceivable that you could build credible models that, that help this process. So my hypothesis, I believe the network monopoly problem and all of its different vestiges in different locations, you know, we do have markets in some places where the invisible hand is supposed to work, but that's pretty limited, I think. You're always going to come up with critical decisions that are really come down to regulatory decisions. So this network monopoly problem, I believe, is more important than our externality problem, because renewables are simply cheaper if they're managed well. Unclear if carbon pricing is really even needed, and if we can really maximize efficiency and or even improve it a lot. Carbon pricing, if you want to go ahead and price the externalities, it's going to be far, far more effective if you can have a system that's more efficient. It's not going to be very effective all by itself. So I think this is something that people in my field don't quite grasp yet. We're all about carbon pricing, but I don't think that's enough. It's not going to create this efficiency due to the network monopoly problem. So open source ultimately aids transparency. Transparency, or kind of symmetric information for everyone, is the key critical ingredient to competition. And competition creates efficiency, and that's going to create rapid decarbonization. So I think that these models and this idea of building big open source platforms are really critical to this if you can do it well. Now, I don't think the modeling is anywhere near to that stage yet. Everyone's building their own models. We need a comprehensive, an extensive open source platform, not just one model, right? That is widely embraced. The more widely it is embraced and lots of different people at different levels understand at least some sense of it, the more effective it'll be in aiding this. So a case study in Hawaii, Matthias can speak about this to more extent, but the two kind of big pieces were, the utility developed a plan for the renewable energy goals, and their plan wasn't very good. It was excessively expensive, and of course favored their own dirty investment over better plans that didn't involve their investment. So Matthias built a model, and it was all open source and a lot more transparent than the utilities assumptions, that showed a different plan that was cheaper and had more renewables sooner. So that is hard to beat back if you're really transparent. So now we're in the process of new performance-based regulation. The performance-based regulation basically sets a cap for the amount of revenue that, a form of revenue decoupling, but it expands the cap to include investment, which it didn't before.
Thank you, Michael. We're kind of getting over time.
I'm just about done.
Great.
So setting this baseline revenue for what the utility is allowed to collect is critical, and having an open source model to set that is really key. And I think Switch is having a lot of influence on that. So anyhow, that's basically it. I think the pitch is it could reduce information asymmetries, making it easier for regulators to make prudent decisions. That's open source in a nutshell.
Thank you, Michael. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'd like to remind everybody that there is a Q&A function at the bottom. So please put your questions in there, because when we get to the discussion time, we will be able to ask the panelists to respond to those. If they are for a specific person, please say who the question is directed at as well. That would be fantastic. Thank you. So moving on, and if Michael, you could stop sharing your screen, that would be fantastic. Our next is Andres Pica, who is the Executive Director in the Interdisciplinary Center for Global Climate Change at Catholic University in Santiago de Chile. Andres has a Master's in Environmental Engineering from the Politecnico di Torino in Italia. And we at EDF have been working on and off with Andres for about 10 years on various aspects of climate policy, ranging from emissions trading to some work on, I think, climate impacts work they've done recently. So he's got many years of experience working on climate policy in Chile. So Andres, over to you, please.
Thanks, Susie. And thank you all for this discussion. It's quite interesting, the issue of open models. Chile has worked a lot related with developing the decarbonization model, not so much about opening these models and giving access to everyone in order to use it or change these models. So in the last 10 years, 11 years, we have had several experience. We have developed from models that are very focused in the electricity sector and are very detailed, and they have a focus in addressing the issues of short-term modeling. And some of these models have been not open at all. They have been constructed for consulting companies that you don't have the access to use it. So every time that you need to update this model, it has to be by this company. Other cases have used more knowledgeable platforms such as Leap, for example, and others. So currently we have in Chile for different projects or initiatives around 4 to 5 official models for different decision-making process. For example, for the long-term energy strategy, we have one. We have another that was made for the discussion of the updating our NDC. We are currently developing a new project, the same as Colombia, with the collaboration of the international, the Inter-American and Development Bank, the Deep Decarbonization long-term strategies for Latin America. So we have been developing a model there also. So, and then we have all the models that are developing by different research centers. So there is a lot of models, and the results of these models are quite different because sometimes because they have been constructed for different purposes. So it's quite different when you try to develop a model that is planning to see what is going to happen next year from another that is trying to figure out what is going to happen in 10 more years or 50 more years. So those issues are quite important, and we have a lot of room to improve this process, at least in Chile. one issue is the process. For mid-term and long-term scenarios, the inputs and assumptions are pretty critical, because if you assume that the demand is going to grow at a 5% rate, it's quite different if you're assuming that it's going to grow at 1% rate. So huge difference of the models are related with these key assumptions that not always are so transparent. So you have results that are very different, and it's only about or mostly about the assumptions, not because the models are constructed very different. So this has been a key issue and continues to be a challenge, because even if these models are being developed for the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Finance, and are somehow official models, we don't have so easy access to understand what is inside of this black box that gives these results. This is quite important, and we have to improve that in order to have a better process. So transparency about this is important, and it's not only about getting access to the reports. The coding of these models is also important, because you, in my experience, every time that I have access to a model that has been developed by someone else, you find errors or bugs, and there is a place to improve. It's not that the other guy is not doing a good job. Everyone makes mistakes, and it's important to have a strong review of the model, not only the results. And the co-construction of the scenarios is a key issue also, because you need to have the stakeholders. If you are having a discussion about the next 10 years in energy policy, the stakeholders have to be there, and they have to have their views inside of this process. It's not only having process in order for them to get a check of what you are doing. You need to really involve them. And this also is related with the uncertainties, especially in the electricity sector. It's pretty hard to address uncertainty because of computational restrictions. You need time to run a lot of scenarios. So, but this is a key issue when you are thinking a future by 2050 or even 2030. The uncertainty of which are going to be the prices of oil and which are going to be the prices of solar panels are a key issue. So this has to be addressed, and sometimes policymakers are a little bit afraid of this, because uncertainties is a hard issue, because normally you get a huge difference on your policies when you try to address these uncertainties. But I think you have to address it, because it's something that it's out there and you can't avoid that. Related with the decarbonization models, one issue that we have to work on, most of the energy models have a strong focus on how the offer is going to be in place, and you have strong optimization models that address that, but they don't address quite well how the demand could change. Not only the growth rate, also the structure of the load shape, because in the future with electric vehicles and other stuff, you can't assume that the demand is going to perform in the same way, and the interaction between offer and demand is going to be quite different in the future, and the modeling of that is something that you have to address very well.
Thanks, Andres. We're running short on time. Do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, so only a few points. The gains of open source models, I find that this is the opportunity to find errors and improvement. It's the opportunity of integration sectors that address disciplinary knowledge of different sectors, more deep engaged with stakeholders that are truly engaged with the process, a transition from a batch decision-making process to a continuous and more dynamic process, and addressing uncertainties and sensitivities related with the future.
Thank you very much. So we'll now move quickly on to Dr. Thomas Brown. Tom is the leader of the Energy Systems Modelling Group at the Institute for Automation and Applied Informatics and the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And interesting fact, before 2012, when he started to work on renewable energy integration, he was a physicist who worked on string theory. So Tom, you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so I have a slightly eccentric career background. So I think most of the previous speakers took all my talking points, so I'll try and improvise a bit and I won't take as much time, hopefully. So I think what's already been addressed is the reason for the openness is we have a lot of difficult decisions and trade-offs to make if we really want to decarbonize the economy over the next few decades. And that's super hard when all the modeling is closed and you can't look inside the models. So I remember a debate we had in Germany 5 years ago about building new transmission lines from north to south in Germany. The network operator was saying, yes, we definitely need these lines, but of course that's their business model. There were other people saying, oh, these lines are only being built for Hello, sorry about that. I think I flew out briefly. Did I disappear?
You disappeared, but you're back now.
Sorry about that. So we had this debate and some people were saying these transmission lines are only being built for dirty lignite plants. Others were saying, well, actually we need these long-term for renewables. And it was a pretty ugly scene, to be honest. And it's very hard to resolve these kind of debates when everyone's using closed models, so you can't look inside to see why one model is giving this result and why one is giving another. And these kind of trade-offs, whether it's on infrastructure, on renewables versus nuclear versus carbon capture and sequestration, whether it's the role of hydrogen, we're going to have these discussions all throughout the next 30 years. And it's very, very hard to do it on a kind of good scientific basis when it's being done with closed models. So that's the sort of justification that echoes a lot what the previous speakers have said. In Europe, we have a lot of modeling exercises, both open and closed. The push for openness has particularly been coming from the research community over the last 10 years as we grapple with complexity and the renewables integration side. There's also been quite a focus on the data requirements we need for these very fine-grained models where you're looking at the building stocks or networks and so on. However, most of the policy making at European and national level is still done with closed models. And I think that's basically because these models, they've been using these same consultants and modeling teams for the last 15 years, and it's very hard for them to switch because they have established relationships with these communities. And we've tried, well, been on the periphery of some bids for French and German modeling, but the ministries, for example, aren't that interested in the open modeling because they have this established closed model who they know and trust. The groups which are interested in the open modeling are those who don't yet have an established modeling process. So that could be companies, for example, who are looking to understand their business models in these future net zero world, or also countries outside Europe, for example, who are using some of the frameworks. But we do see increasing interest in the policymakers, and they're also funding some of that modeling. So if we look at these big modeling exercises done by the Commission with primes, for example, it's done in a closed fashion. You can see some of the input values, but a lot of the details are really not there for inspection. There's famous examples in the past where they had very, very high discount rates for building efficiency measures, which then made efficiency much less attractive. And that was there, but buried under 300 pages of documentation. One interesting example that's happened recently is two big groups of NGOs, Climate Action Network Europe and the European Environmental Bureau, got together and built some open scenarios for how they imagined with their stakeholders that the decarbonization of Europe would look. They published this as open data, and now modeling groups, us included, are taking those scenarios and breaking them down to see how that looks on a country and on, say, an hourly basis. To address one of the questions in the comments, why should policymakers and NGOs go open? Well, I see lots of benefits there. First of all, it's transparency for you. If you hire consultants with a closed model, they may not reveal to you all the details. It's transparent for the public. It's lower cost for sure. You can also reuse the model and reuse the results yourself and avoid lock-in with the consultant. I think that's a really big point for people who are repeatedly doing exercises. And one other one, of course, is the community that you can tap when you release the model openly. People can come and remix your scenarios. So a sort of utopic vision that Michael also mentioned earlier is that you have some set of open models which are used by lots of different groups. And when there's a question about whether something is required or not, you can then go in and see why one group is finding one result and one finding the other. And this just isn't possible to have this level of debate with closed models. Finally, I want to just highlight osmosis. It's already been mentioned. This actually is widely used in the policy space outside Europe. Costa Rica, for example, has been using it to set up a full pipeline full open pipeline for policy advice. This is one of the big success stories, I think, of open modeling being used in the policy space. So I'll stop there. We can't hear you, Susie.
For that excellent, sorry. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. So we have one more speaker, and I'm afraid we are running out of time for discussion. So please do use the Q&A feature, put your questions in. The panelists, I'm sure, will be delighted to give you some answers through that online. So before we move to the next session, we have one more fantastic speaker. We have David Daniels, who is the ex-chief energy modeler from the US Energy Information Administration, and he's currently a visiting researcher at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Susie. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine, and you have 5 minutes or less. Thanks.
I'll use less. That's too bad, actually, because I was looking forward to the Q&A. I think what I have to say is probably less important than the Q&A, but being as it may. Yes, I was the chief energy modeler at the US Energy Information Administration, EIA, until about a month ago. So I don't speak on behalf of EIA, but I can talk to you about my experiences there. I think the way Oleg put it at the beginning of the session was exactly right. Open source is important. Open data is important, but those are maybe necessary but not sufficient requirements. What's important is what he said, which was accessibility, is the ability for people to take these models, run them themselves if they want to, poke and prod at it, kick the tires, if you will, so that they have confidence that the models are giving them reasonable results. Because as some of the questions that have come through in the Q&A have asked, you know, how are these models used by policymakers? Well, the policymakers aren't going to use a model that gives them a surprising result that they don't understand, that they don't have confidence in, that they are then going to bet their political future on. Absolutely not going to happen. They have to have confidence in these models. Open source is important, but I can tell you from the experience at EIA, it's probably not sufficient. EIA's primary model for the US is the NEMS model, National Energy Modeling System. NEMS is not open source. And it's not open source, not for any nefarious reason, simply because it was built in 1993 when the phrase open source hadn't yet been invented. There was talk until at least a month ago about making the models at EIA open source. What would it take to make the models at EIA open source? Turns out it wouldn't be that hard. But there's very little incentive to do so. Why? Because the models are already available. If you want a copy of the source code of NEMS, just send them an email and they'll send you a copy of the source code of NEMS. It turns out doing that doesn't solve anyone's problems. What they want to know is, can I run NEMS? And the answer to that is almost certainly not. It's way too complicated for you, whoever you are. I mean, look, there are a handful of people that can do it, but it's really hard. And the second question they want to know is, can I find the place where you put in the thing about the Barnett shale that talks about the decline curves? And yeah, okay, it's in there, it's buried in there, but there's, you know, a million lines of code, and finding the place where that goes in, that one's actually pretty easy to find. It's documented nicely. But there's a lot of assumptions like that that people want to know, and they want to be able to look at the code. You can look at the code and it won't help you. Why is it doing that? Well, a lot of the times our modelers who built the code don't know why it's doing that. So important, but maybe not sufficient. Another thing that has come up is a really good, important topic, is that it's not so much the models themselves, it's the assumptions that go into it. It's not just the data. Data is always historical. People want to know, okay, and how do the historical trends change going forward? That's the special sauce. One of the things that EIA does kind of explicitly, and there's been a couple of research papers that have kind of made this point very, very softly, but it's a really important point to make, is that models, although we pretend that they're objective, really are not. They're very subjective. It's almost like the mechanical Turk, if you remember that illustration. The model is the mechanism, but the Turk, the person, the human element, the modeler that makes the subjective decisions about how things might change going forward. Sure, we can all measure the price elasticity of demand. How will it change going forward? That's the thing that we want to know. I'll leave you with one final thought. The NEMS model is usually considered to be very conservative and very brittle. And by that, what you people usually mean is when we ask it the question, how do we decarbonize the US economy? The answer is usually like, not a number kind of a thing. It can't do it, it chokes. And the reason NEMS chokes is actually a very important reason. It wasn't designed to do that. It was designed to do perturbation analysis. And it's very, very good at doing perturbation analysis. If you change something by epsilon, where epsilon is infinitesimally small, it will give you the right answer. For example, we have been asked, actually, by Congress, which is our funder, and therefore our customer, could you please tell us if we make a change to a policy that changes the requirements on efficiency of certain size industrial motors, what would the impact be on US employment? How many other people's energy models can answer that question? Anyone? Anyone? We get asked that EIA gets asked that question. And with that same model, people want to say, and how do we decarbonize the economy? Those are very, very different questions. Usually one model isn't sufficient to do that. So I think what I'll leave you with is open source good, but you kind of need horses for courses, right? A different model to answer different questions. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to look at a collection of models, all of which you can examine, look at the internal details to get an overall picture of where you want to go from a policy perspective.
Thank you, David. That was an excellent rounding off. I'm hearing a lot of very consistent messages across the different users and modelers, and a lot of outstanding challenges. So this is clearly the beginning of a much longer conversation, or maybe we've jumped in partway through the conversation. With that, I'll pass over to Oleg to look at the second half, the second panel, where we go deeper on the modeling. Thanks, Oleg.
Thank you, Susie. Thank you, everyone. Excellent discussion. I want, actually, we don't have time for Q&A, but we will share the link, and actually maybe we can do it on Openmod website, because we already have announcement on Openmod, so we can, if there's any questions to modelers or participants, we can potentially like go there and continue the discussion. Okay, I'm starting with, so now our session is regarding existing modeling initiatives already happening, and some of them known for maybe a decade or more. And so I'm going to give the floor to Tom Brown again to discuss PIPESA project. So I will be very brief in introduction. So sorry, so we just keep in time. Okay, Tom, floor is yours. You're muted, Tom. Yeah.
So I need to unmute before I share. Sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. I just also refer people to the Openmod website that has listed some of the models, and there's also a link there to the Open Energy Modeling Open Energy platform that also has another more recent collection of models. It's interesting to look at the genesis, because there were only 3 open models before 2010. I think it must be Joe's Tomoa and possibly Osmosis as well. I can't remember exactly what the 3 are, but there's been a real flood in the last 10 years, and you can find them there. And I think that's largely been driven by the decarbonization and the kind of complexity needs of the renewable integration, and also funding bodies increasingly demanding openness. And as I said, they're used quite widely. I think these models are typically the frameworks that we use, the math equations that are behind the models. But there's also the data side that makes an instance that makes it available for South Africa or India or Europe or whatever. And I think this is really where the big benefit is for other researchers, and where the challenges are is really getting a lot of this data into the model. Especially when we look at other sectors beyond electricity, it's really hard to get good quality data on the building stock, on the location of industrial sites and how they can be switched, like the lifetimes and ages of industrial equipment, for example. Biomass availability is really hard to get it in high resolution and so on. So I think this is one area where we'll see a lot of a bigger push in the community. And as has already been mentioned, if you just Google Openmod, you can find that there, but Taco mentioned it already, I think. So I'll just give you a few flashes of what we're doing and what other people are doing with Python for power system analysis, which is a tool that I've been involved with developing, but it's really a team effort. So Jonas Hirsch was very much involved with the coding of the framework, and my group at Karlsruhe has been pushing that forward as well. It's basically, it's an open source framework for modeling, something between grid modeling and also energy system optimization, where we go so high enough resolution that we can see the changes of renewables in time and space, and then look again, of course, at electrification of the other sectors. So we're not just looking at the power sector with the model. There's a lot of people using it, and I think one of the reasons why it's been popular is not necessarily the quality of the software or anything in particular, but very early on we wrote a lot of documentation and a lot of examples for the model. So we made small working examples of how you set up typical problems and put them online with a lot of documentation. And this is a big part of the model's popularity, rather than its sort of technical prowess or anything, is that we put a lot of effort on that early on to make it usable. And people do use the model without any help from us. And I think that's primarily because the documentation is good. The group of people using it is quite diverse. It's a lot of research institutes, but also companies. So evil oil companies as well. I mean, a lot, yeah, it's a different discussion, but Shell using it for its electricity market modeling. Saudi Aramco was using it for some renewables modeling. Network operator Transnet BV was using it sort of internally, and a few other examples that I'll come to in a second. So one nice example recently, which was possibly one of the most impactful things that's been done with the software, was the Energy and Resources Institute in New Delhi, funded by the Energy Transitions Commission with money from Bloomberg and Hewlett Foundation, I think, did a study for India, looking at the power system in 2030 and how that would cope with high levels of renewables. So looking how the thermal units would cope with additional ramping and how storage could mitigate that, for example. And this is one of the first studies that's really been done from, or it's one of these big grid modeling studies that's been done from inside India. There was an NREL study that was done from outside, looking at India in 2022, but this is really something homegrown. And the reasons why they chose open source in this case was not just a lower cost, that was certainly part of it, but the customizability was very important, that they could go into and change the constraints. It was very good for building up skills and passing on to other stakeholders. The alternative would have been commercial software Plexos, where they would have had to pay license fees, and then it's harder to transfer. Another example, we partnered with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. They're looking at different alternatives for decarbonization in the system, with a particular focus on the grid again. There are also commercial users, and I think this is a sign of the growing credibility of the open source software, is that you have companies coming in and taking some of these models for their own research. So they took a sector-coupled version of pipes, as it's an instance of the framework where it's a European model with all the different sectors modeled, and they wanted to look at the requirements for their network, how it might have to be built out in a not net zero, but I think 95 or 90% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050. And again, the reasoning was it was just easier and better than building their own model from scratch. They could take what was already there and then customize it. So one of the motivations for us and what we're doing with it is really to try and look at some of these difficult trade-offs. So in our research, we're really focused on these trade-offs we think are coming in the next 30 years, especially with regard to public acceptance of infrastructure. So we've seen a lot of difficulties with new transmission lines, overhead transmission lines, and onshore wind in Europe, and how to manage this, how to model the effects of this low social acceptance for some of the infrastructure is why we've been pushing these very, very detailed models. So how do we have a debate about the trade-offs involved in land usage and landscape impact and the importance there of having the open models? So you can manage a lot of this, manage these grid bottlenecks, and also manage, the inability to build onshore wind by using flexibility in the system. And we build models for that to look at how in other sectors we can move energy in time with demand side management or thermal storage, for example, or looking into other sectors like the hydrogen sector, where we can maybe move around energy with power to gas and avoid some of the controversial electricity grid infrastructure. So these are all sort of very kind of contentious questions that are coming up over the next 30 years, and where we think that there should be focused with these high resolution models. A lot of this modeling is really not done at this high resolution, which is why we need to push it. A lot of it's done at sort of country level where you can't see the grid bottlenecks. And what we're currently trying to do with the model is basically manage to get all of those different sectors into the model, whether it's electricity, hydrogen, methane. Carbon dioxide management becomes very important to decarbonization. So if you need synthetic fuels for aviation or in the shipping, you need to look very carefully at your carbon dioxide management. You need to look very carefully at carbon capture usage and sequestration as well, and how that can be done from point sources in industry or in the electricity business or even from the air. I mean, these are all very, very uncertain things when we look at particularly the industry sector. And again, it's important to have it open. And looking then at how that plays out with bottlenecks in the system. So that's basically what we're currently doing. It's very, very data heavy. And one advantage of the openness is that we can take data from other sources. So a lot of our renewable potentials are taken from another colleague's product. The time series come from a variety of different open products, and we're really sort of integrating these into the model. And I think in some sense we see ourselves more as integrators than trying to cover the full suite by ourselves. So we've done a couple of scenarios, and I don't actually have time to go through that, so I'll just flick through them where we look at this relatively high resolution modeling and push the CO2 down to 0 and see what happens when we have different levels of expansion, whether we have no grid expansion from today, where we are very heavily then relying on synthetic fuels, a little bit of grid expansion and more grid expansion, and we can sort of track those trade-offs where we vary the amount of transmission and see the impact it has on the system. We've also done similar things where we vary the amount of onshore wind, the other controversial thing, or one of the other controversial things in the system, and look at sort of compromises where we have less onshore wind and it gets substituted for offshore and solar and some power to gas. And we can then see the sort of cost trade-offs, the kind of thing that we're trying to do with the modeling. And because it involves very big changes, one of the things that helps to relieve the electricity network is a hydrogen network, which has become a very hot topic in Europe right now. How much hydrogen will there be in the future? Yep, okay, I'm going to stop. So one other thing we do for accessibility is looking at animations online, and there's 2 examples there just to make the models a bit more accessible. So sorry, there's a bit of a grab bag selection of things, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Tom. I have my own questions, but we don't have, we have hopefully discussion in the end. And so I'm just passing the floor to Joe Decarolis, North Carolina University and developer of TIMA model. Joe, 10 minutes, please.
Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. Let's put this into presentation mode. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about a model that we've developed called TOMOA, which stands for Tools for Energy Model Optimization and Analysis. I wanted to start by actually talking about a new project that we have. This is an application of the model. So I'm going to talk about this for a second to tell you a little bit more about the model, and then also end by talking about some of the things we've done to try and minimize the barriers to entry that I think apply more generally to other models. So in terms of an application, we have a 3-year project to develop an open energy outlook for the United States. It's funded by the Sloan Foundation. And these are some of the key features of that effort. So first, we want to focus on deep decarbonization pathways in the United States. We want to utilize open source tools, models, and data. We want to be able to maximize transparency. We want to be able to assess key model sensitivities and future uncertainties. We've developed a team of about 35 people that are actively contributing to the effort, and we also want to promote broader community involvement in the effort. So David mentioned earlier about NEMS being designed for perturbation analysis. TOMOA in this effort is much more designed around being flexible so that we can look at really dramatic policy initiatives and then see the appropriate response in the energy system. We feel like our niche is actually looking at the whole energy system, not just electricity. And when we're talking about deep decarbonization, it's important to take this whole energy systems view. You know, many policy proposals target the full energy system, and we need to know where those reductions are possible and at what cost. There's also a lot of system-wide pathways. So Tom, for example, mentioned power to gas. That's an example where we want to be able to model the whole system to see how the uptake of that pathway works. And again, it allows us to explore system-wide changes and look at these interaction effects across different sectors endogenously. So what exactly is TOMOA? It's an open source energy system optimization model. So if you're familiar, for example, with Markel, Times, Osmosis, it's similar to those. The way that we conceive of the energy system in these kinds of models is according to the network diagram that I have here. So you've got a set of energy technologies which are represented by the green boxes. Those technologies are connected together in a network by the flow of energy commodities that are represented by the blue circles. And it's doing linear optimization. And the objective function is to basically minimize the present cost of energy supply over some time horizon. We need to make sure that energy commodity is balanced globally. So I need to produce enough electricity to meet the demand for electricity. We also need to ensure energy balance at the individual process level. And these models are performing capacity expansion. So not just for a single point in time, but looking at growing demand, retirement of existing capacity, and the construction of new capacity. And the decision variables are basically the amount of new installed capacity, as well as the utilization of all technology capacity across the energy system. And it's making those decisions based on the engineering economic characteristics of individual technologies, like things like capital cost, fixed and variable operations and maintenance costs, capacity factor, efficiencies, and emissions coefficients. It's optimizing, I said it's doing capacity expansion, so it's optimizing over a set of user-defined future time periods. Each time period is a set of years, and then what the model is doing is optimizing a representative year within each time period, and then that representative year is then broken down into a number of time slices that are user-defined. So you could represent every hour in the year, you could have representative days, or you could have aggregations of times of day and seasons. It's up to the user. But those time slices define the time over which supply and demand is balanced. We designed TOMOA, we've been working on this for about a decade. We wanted to be to enable repeatable analysis, and that meant making the source code and the data both open source and publicly available so that third parties could take it and actually replicate our work. And the other thing is we really wanted to focus on uncertainty quantification. Instead of just running a few scenarios, coming up with more rigorous ways of assessing future uncertainty. We've worked hard to develop an open source software stack. So not just making our code open source, but also trying to use software elements that are open source so that we can help minimize the barriers to entry and reduce the amount of money people have to spend to build a new software. We use a lot of tools that are Python based, and Python is a very large ecosystem. And so it's easy to pull in other libraries and modules that other people have developed to give our effort more functionality. And one thing I want to mention, and this is common to a lot of these types of models, is that the input data is independent of the model code. The model code operates on an input data set, and as long as that input data set is formatted as needed, then the model code can operate it on it. So we have this independence between the code and the input data, which means you can go off and create your own input data set and then run it with the existing code. So I want to we've spent a lot of time thinking about, barriers to entry and how to overcome those. And the three biggest barriers in my mind, and again, these comments echo a lot of what you've already heard, are transparency, ease of use, and cost. To me, those are the main challenges. We've tried to minimize costs by making everything open source and then utilizing open source software elements. As far as transparency and ease of use, the thing I want to emphasize is, at least to me, they're never-ending journeys. They're not destinations. There's no time at which I decide, okay, I think the model's now transparent. There's always more that we can do to make the effort more transparent and the model easier to use for new users. And the other thing that's important to realize, that even if you meet all of the above conditions, you've done everything you can to minimize barriers, the model has to be well matched to the problem at hand. And every analysis is going to have its own objectives, and we need to make sure that we're selecting the right tools in order to perform that analysis. So these are the things we've done to reduce barriers to entry. Again, there's always more that we can do. I'm never satisfied with where we are, but these are the actions that we've taken. So again, we utilize an open source software stack so that folks don't have to spend a bunch of money on commercial software in order to run the model. We've tried to develop well-designed code so that you can look at the code and understand what's going on. We've tried to build good documentation. So we've built the documentation into the code base. We document constraints and the objective function with doc strings, which are then automatically read and put into the user manual. We've developed some tutorials, some just very simple video-based tutorials to help guide users. You need to provide a way for model users to communicate. So we have a Google group where people can ask questions and get some answers. There's also a lot of software elements involved. And so we have an environment file that allows you to set up the software environment programmatically. And this seems like maybe a minor thing, but it's actually a big deal, because if you're not using exactly the right versions of certain pieces of software, it can break our model. So we've set it up in a way where you can install a version of the model environment that we know is guaranteed to work. And it eases this transition to getting the model set up. And then finally, we have a cloud-based interface. So if you're not interested in installing the model on your local machine, you have the capability to basically run it on the cloud and get results that you can then pull back down to your local machine. So again, I think these are just some examples. These are things that we've tried, and I think these are all ways that we can take these existing models that we've developed that are open source and make it easier for new users to get involved in the process and do their own analysis. And this is the last slide. I just wanted to leave with a set of key links to some of our own efforts. And with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you very much, Joe. The next speaker will be Matthias Fripp, University of Hawaii, and developer of Switch model.
Okay, hi, I hope you all can see my screen. So thanks for having me. This is a really exciting panel to be on. I'm going to talk about Switch. I guess in contrast to NEMS, this really is designed to try to tackle that problem, that question of how do you get to 100% renewables? How do you completely decarbonize? So it's a very granular bottom-up model design. In particular, we're really focused on this question of how do you build an all renewable power system? And a lot of the questions that come up there are in the time domain. And you've sort of layered into a lot of the discussions we've had of other models today, or discussions of how they handle time. And I would argue, time is a really important driver for model design. It also is a very big challenge. So sort of fundamentally, when you're designing a 100% renewable power system, there's two sort of main problems you've got to address. One is, as you build more and more solar and possibly wind, you end up with too much power during the day, too little at night, and you need to use storage or cleverly use thermal power plants to do that kind of balancing. And to model that, you need to actually know the sequence of hours in the day. You need to say, well, we can charge our batteries in the morning, discharge in the evening, and get through. There's also time problems that there are some days that are lower in sun, maybe high in load, and you've still got to serve those. So you get this seasonal balancing challenge. And then another dimension of time is how are we going to evolve over decades to solve this problem? There are sort of a plethora of options, which is one reason we need tools. It used to be you could either have an expensive, efficient power plant, thermal power plant, or an inexpensive, inefficient power plant. And it was a fairly simple problem to solve, and you didn't need to have so much time detail. Now we've got all these demand response batteries, biofuels, hydrogen, so many choices. So we need new tools to address this question in the policy process, as people have talked about. So Switch is designed to have sort of, I don't know, I have this kind of wish list of things that you would want to design an all renewable power system. Switch is open source software focused particularly on power system design, although it's kind of extensible into other sectors. And one, as I said, is you need chronological sequencing within the day so that you can model relations between hours, that when you're going to store, when you're going to discharge. Can you move the air conditioning load from day to evening with ice storage or something? I would say you also need multiple investment periods in order to model a sort of step transition from what we have now to what we need in the future, and to model the lifetime of assets that are in place now. Ideally, this should be adaptable and extendable, and that's been a big challenge. Well, I'm talking about Switch 2. Switch 1 was not so extendable, but that was a big focus in version 2, was to make it something that you can easily adapt. And as you get into this time, having all this amount of time, oops, I'm not drawing very well, you can easily make a model that's too big and has too many details, especially if you get into unit commitment and so on. And so you need to be able to turn features of the model on and off in order to make very detailed local models, even down to the microgrid scale, or much coarser sort of national scale and continental scale models. And that's a kind of adaptability you need. And then you need to consider local policies and some kind of new technology that has weird rules that you want to add in. For lots of reasons, this should be open source. It supports accessibility, low cost, easy access, but also sort of consensus building in the regulatory process, where you can say, look, everything we've done in our plan is open. You can look at it and see what you like or don't like, and we can argue about the details instead of the outcome from a black box. So I think Switch is maybe unique, maybe at least unusual in its ability to include all these elements. And I think some of the models people are talking about today are similar. We're kind of all aiming to some extent for similar things. It's open source. It has a completely open source stack built on a lot of the same tools as PyPSA and Temoa. Our sort of secret sauce, if we have one, is that You can have a user-defined number of sample days. So we have chronological sequencing on sample days, but you don't have to cover every day in the year. And that lets us then model years with a sparser set of days, and then we can model multiple years to do that transition. And it sounded like Timoa has some of that. We tend to see models that either have a full year of sample days, but not multiple years, or multiple years with a lot less detail. I'm not going to go into these, but they're in the record here. And we have documentation as well at switchmodel.org. To some extent, I'll talk about that. But anyway, we have the sort of objective function constraints that you'd expect. Switch is choosing what to build and co-optimizing that with how it would operate it hour by hour on these sample days. There are constraints that you can put in, or extra cost functions for carbon or renewable targets, and those are kind of user customizable. What's turned out to be a really nice feature of Switch in this new version too, is that it's very extensible. So there's sort of a core model, which is drawn schematically here, which defines, it's really a very generic sort of optimization problem. And actually now we're working on a model where it's only the gas network for the US and you throw out everything else, but there's still a sort of optimization framework in there. And each of these sort of elements of the power system or energy system is represented in a module, and they're all sort of first-class members. So you can use the existing modules. You can say, I want this set or that set of modules to get into more detail in certain areas and less detail in other areas. Some are either or choices, which are shown here with sort of dotted lines. So you can have a fuel market, or you can have just simple sort of fixed costs for fuels. For a particular study, you choose, okay, I want this set of modules. So this might be a long-term capacity expansion plan, and you're using somewhat coarse sort of representation of transmission network and demand response, but maybe you are using fuel markets. Then once you've got your plan, you say, well, now I want to go back and evaluate that every day over a full year or over 30 years. Which is a production cost model rather than capacity expansion. And so you can use almost the same input data and say, well, I'm going to switch from my simple demand response modeling to an advanced form. I'm going to turn off this sort of aggregated transport model for transmission and actually have AC power flow. I'm probably giving it too much. It looks more final there than it really is, but we do have experimental support for AC power flow. But the main idea is you can turn these on and off, and you can also write your own. So I think here I had region-specific modules, and they could be technology-specific too. If you're a geothermal developer, you can represent your new geothermal technology. So this ability to choose among different ready-made modules, so you can kind of snap them together like Lego bricks and say, this is what represents our system well, technologically. And then also, like the others, you bring your own data to run it. So this is a code framework distinct from the data, but obviously you need data inputs as well. And then you can also write specific modules for local behavior. What are our local RPS rules? What is this weird carbon cost we're planning, and so forth? And what are our tax structures like locally? I'm trying to move fast to keep us on schedule here. What comes out of it is a model with results with a lot of hourly data. We're actively balancing production against consumption. Hopefully these add up. We're also maintaining reserve margins and doing unit commitment to support that. It is an open framework, not as well documented as the others, but it has had quite a bit of uptake in a number of regions around the world, and I'm actively using it in Hawaii in very detailed form and in the regulatory process here. I think barriers for entry and where we're at in trying to address these, you need good documentation. We have good documentation for practitioners, I would say. We've got a basic tutorial, we've got a paper on model formulation. So, if you're willing to invest some effort, you can get there, and people do, but it's still hard. We need finer scale documentation. The code itself is also self-documenting, but saying go read the code does not appeal to everyone. Data is a huge issue, as everyone has said, and I think we need to talk about that more, but getting data for your local power system is important. We're working on national models now, and I think there's hope once we got national data sets that we could break off regional data sets and sort of re-aggregate to do regional studies and state level studies. Infrastructure, so far, you've got to download and install everything. We make that easy, kind of a one-liner to install all the support, the dependencies in the code and open source solvers. But on the other hand, that's still too much for a lot of people. So having a cloud environment, I think I'm done. Having a cloud environment where you could do this, oh yeah, I'm over time, would help a lot. And so I think we'd like to get there in the long run. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthias. So the next speaker will be JC Jenkins, professor of Princeton University and the developer of Gen X framework. JC? Matthias, please stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, it's gone off screen. I'm not sure how to stop it. It's taken over. Hold on, I think I'm gonna leave and come back because I don't see a control to stop. Oh, there we go.
You go up to the window, maybe at the top, you can.
Yeah, it's hiding behind my video, sorry. There. Whew.
Okay, good.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a sort of collection of efforts that I've been part of to help break down some barriers to broader use of open source macro scale energy system models outside of the research community. So I think, as you've seen, there's a proliferation of models for open source development and use in the academic research community. That's been a huge and important trend. It's helped us avoid a huge amount of time to recreate the wheel each time a researcher wants to start answering a question. Instead, we can go pick up a fit for purpose open source model that already exists and start tackling research questions and finding original insights much more rapidly due to that existing open source community. But as I've worked with NGOs and stakeholders and policymakers in the US context, I've realized that there are significant barriers still to use of open source tools, even when they're available outside of the academic community. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what I see as the key barriers there and a couple of our efforts to start bringing some of those down and some remaining challenges that I want to flag for the community to think more about. So I want to start by just saying an open source model isn't enough. I'll talk in a minute about the Gen X model that I helped develop with Nestor Sepulveda at MIT and is in wide use in both MIT and my group at Princeton. And we've been encouraged and are planning to open source the model, and we're going to do so soon, but haven't done so yet because as you hear from these examples, dumping a model code on the internet and calling it open source is far from sufficient to guarantee uptake. If you want to see the kind of adoption that we've seen for models like PIPESA or others, you need a significant amount of documentation, you need training materials, you need example setup, and ideally support, which we'll talk about in a minute for users and the user community. And so we've been working very steadily to sort of put the pieces together to guarantee successful release and uptake of the tools that we're building in my group and make sure there's an ecosystem around those tools so that they can actually be used by people outside of the academic research community for engagement with policymaking decisions and regulatory planning. So I see 4 major barriers to widespread use of these tools. The first, of course, is that you need a good model that's fit for purpose, right? That's the prerequisite. And when I say fit for purpose, I think you heard in Matthias's talk and in Tom's talk and others about how the increasing complexity of decarbonization challenges, both the growth of renewable resources and demand flexibility and storage, which makes the electricity sector modeling much more complicated, requiring greater spatial and temporal resolution to provide accurate answers than we needed in the past. And also the integration of the electricity sector with other sectors across the economy, creating sector coupling challenges that often are missed when you're looking at sector-specific models. So we're pushing these models in huge expanding directions in terms of their complexity. And if you're going to try to answer a policy-related question, you need a state-of-the-art tool that is able to actually answer the questions on our minds today, and not necessarily the sort of widely available tools that are commonly used in the past and maybe trusted by stakeholders, but perhaps need to be revisited. So the first thing is a set of fit-for-purpose models, and I think you're seeing that there is a growing proliferation of options available for people, which is bringing down this barrier quite successfully. The second, though, which you heard Matthias allude to just now, is the need for data. So when I say model, and we had a little bit of discussion about this in the Q&A, I mean the software and its implementation of an algebraic programming model, a mathematical formulation to represent a set of constraints and parameters and optimize the cost of those systems. That is a generic model, and it can be used in any particular context if you have the data to parameterize it. So creating and using a model, or parameterizing and using a model to answer a particular question in a particular context requires accessible, transparent, and reliable data. And as these models become more complex in their resolution, the data needs are increasingly one of the principal barriers to running these models. So it's not just enough to have a sense of annual energy demand for these, for various fuel sources or vehicle miles traveled on an annual basis or things like that. We need hourly temporal resolution to really model the electricity sector in detail. We need to understand linkages between multiple sectors at a wide scale. And so as the complexity of the models increases, the availability of accessible, transparent, reliable data and its ease of use for modeling becomes one of the central challenges. So, in our group, we've had this great Gen X electricity system model I'll tell you about in a minute, but every time we want to answer a new question, we can spend weeks or months developing the data required to answer that question. And that's problematic. We need to be able to think about tools that we can build to reduce that time to set up models and to answer questions, particularly when we're talking about the policymaking community where answers are needed on a timely basis to make important decisions that have hard deadlines, right? The policymaking process is not going to wait for us to complete a new academic study. And so we need to have the ability to provide insights on a rapid basis in response to pending questions. The third barrier is one that we often, I think, don't anticipate, or don't appreciate within the academic community where this is not so much of an issue. But in order to solve large-scale optimization models of the type we're talking about, we need both efficient solvers and high-performance computing resources to be able to crunch through the solutions to very large-scale problems. Toy models, simpler setups can be solved with desktop computers and open source solvers, but the most efficient solvers are very expensive proprietary tools like CPlex from IBM and Gurobi, which can cost several $100,000 for single user licenses and are often more prohibitive than anything else we're talking about here. So we need to figure out ways that we can either break down our models through decomposition methods that make them amenable for solutions with open source tools, or we need to find other ways to lower the upfront costs and convert them to variable costs through cloud computing platforms for access to solvers and computing resources needed to solve these types of models outside of an academic environment where we have high performance computing clusters and licenses for proprietary models are available for free for academics. And finally, we need to provide an ecosystem of training and support and help for users of these tools, particularly users that don't come out of an academic tradition and need to learn how to treat these in some ways as giant calculators, where they don't necessarily need to know exactly what's going on inside them, but they do need to know how to manipulate and use them to answer particular questions. And so we need training materials beyond, I think, just documentation, but also, workshops, online videos, example, code set up for particular types of studies, and ideally a tech support system, someone available that people can call or ask questions via forums and get timely answers, so that they don't get frustrated with these tools and leave them to go back to paying high-priced consultants to answer the questions for them or whatever else they've had to do before that. So I see all four of these barriers as important, and building a good model only addresses the first one of those. And so I think we need to focus a lot more of our attention as a community on the remaining three as well. So I'll just briefly talk about a couple of our efforts to tackle the first two and some thoughts about the final two. So in our group, we've built out as a tool at MIT with the MIT Energy Initiative a model called GenX, which, like Switch and PIPESA, is a kind of state-of-the-art and very flexible LP or a mixed integer linear programming model to capture all the sorts of challenges we need in terms of spatial and operational and temporal complexity for power system modeling in a changing landscape with high shares of variable renewables and deep decarbonization goals. So it has many of the same features as PIPESA and Switch. It's coded in Julia and Jump as opposed to Python, another open source set of packages for software and high performance computing. And we built it to be very configurable because the spatial scope or temporal resolution or operational detail that matters for particular questions will differ from study to study. And so rather than build a single model with a single configuration, we made it more of a Swiss Army knife where you can pull out particular tools that are fit for the particular job. But much like a Swiss Army knife, due to computational limits, you can't take all the tools out and use them at once. So if you try to go to the highest degree of resolution on every front, your solution probably won't solve. So we can co-optimize capacity and hourly operational decisions for up to a full year of chronological sequential decisions. We can include detailed operating constraints like unit commitment decisions and operating reserves. And we can co-optimize transmission network expansion along with our generation and storage decisions. It was originally a tool created at the MIT Energy Initiative by Nestor and I. It's been actively used by a variety of research groups at MIT since we've moved on, and by my group at Princeton. And we're working hard to improve the code base and documentation and ready it for an open source release in February to add another tool to the list of available models. But equally important, as I mentioned, isn't the model, but the data to run it. And so in collaboration with Greg Shively and Carbon Impact Consulting and the environmental NGO Clean Air Task Force, we've been working over the last year to build out what we call the Power Genome Data Platform, which is an open source set of scripts, or data platform as we're calling it, to configure, to make the task of configuring inputs for electricity system models much easier, replicable, and faster for users. So it's a set of scripts. Sure. It's a set of scripts that compile for the, data for user-specified geographic scope and level of aggregation for anywhere in the US. So if I want to run a study that's focused on New Jersey, I might zoom in on New Jersey and have a few neighboring regions. If I want to do a study for the whole US, I might have 3 different models, one for each interconnection. And so the spatial scope and the level of aggregation or detail that we can afford will change from problem to problem. And Power Genome allows that to be flexibly aggregated and specified by the user. It's built on top of the open source public utilities data liberation project effort, which is pulling together a lot of data from EIA, EPA, FERC, and other sources into a single common relational database. And to that, we add a bunch of data from the EPA's IPM model and NREL's reads and annual technology baseline data sets, as well as high quality wind and solar resource data from Vibrant Clean Energy, and a set of candidate project areas for wind and solar development that reflects a land area availability screen for the entire US, completed as part of Princeton's Net Zero America project. So basically all the pieces we need to set up an electricity system model for anywhere in the United States in any geographic context. And we hope, and this is still a beta version, so we just released sort of 0.3 a little while ago, and we're going to be improving steadily over the next few months. But this is the kind of effort we think that we need to create the data infrastructure that makes modeling with any of these tools, whether it's GenX or Switch or PIPSA or Tomoa, much easier and faster for users in any context in the US. And similar efforts are ongoing in Europe with the open data projects, and we need similar efforts across the world, I believe. So finally, I think we're tackling, at least in the US context, the first 2 challenges quite effectively, but that leaves the last 2. And these are things that I think are challenging for academics to address. And we need to sort of think outside of our typical research environment and think about how we can act as support for non-researchers tackling important decision-making questions. And if there's a role that academics can play in creating an infrastructure for support and training, or building our models to work not with our own high-performance computing and commercial solvers, but with the kinds of environments that non-academics face, either desktop computers with open source solvers or cloud computing options that might bring down the upfront cost barrier, but require redesigning our software to interface effectively with cloud computing options. And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, JC. Thank you, everyone. So we don't have time again for Q&A, and what I can say, so we can continue discussion on Openmod forum. So I want to finish this session with one open question. So where we started. So the impression is that tools are available, and more great analysis will be coming soon, I guess, for decarbonization in different countries. My question is how to reapply your tools for other countries. What kind of project you would envision? We cannot fundraise for 100-year project for 100 countries and 1 million per one country. We don't have time for that. And so the question is how to scale up, and what kind of project, will be the business model for that to make it happen? because otherwise we will stop talking and it will not happen at all. So we just, I leave the question open, so because it's 1 p.m. and we have to stop, but I think it's not over, so it's a good start. We did a small step forward, and I look forward for further steps in this initiative and any other open source and decarbonization initiatives. Thank you all for participation. We have to finish now, so you will have the link for the recording and the forum after the session. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Good to see you all.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Oleg
Oleg.
did it all. and Tokolo, who's invisible.
Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you all. Have a nice evening or day.
Thank you. Good night.
Morning.
Night.